now we get to the discussion portion of it. I want to open it up to the people that spoke. So if you could kindly unmute yourself or give me one quick second. One thing I wanted to start off with was the whole idea of nuclear technology and the need for nuclear reactors in the Middle East. UAE is developing an agreement with South Korea to build 4 nuclear reactors in UAE. As you know, the Japanese government is pretty much shutting down its nuclear technology for producing energy. The Germans are doing the same and are moving to solar and wind and other sources, as well as natural gas. So why do we have a need in the Middle East, in such a hot conflict, to have nuclear technology by countries like UAE and Iran and the rest? And I'll put that to the panel of speakers.
Well, I can start with a quick comment. I know Norman and I are very strong opponents of nuclear power in the United States or anywhere else. But as long as the US and others use nuclear power, the Iranians have, in my view, every right to develop it as well. And if you go back to the 1960s, when the Shah was in power, there was many reports needed nuclear energy as an alternative. And in fact, the US was prepared, the Europeans and the US, to sell Iran 10 nuclear reactors to generate power. And of course, that all ended in 1979 with the revolution. But you have to have one yardstick. If it's okay for the US to have nuclear power, then it's okay for Iran to have it. If I was Iranian, I would be out in the streets demonstrating against nuclear power and in favor of wind and solar and other alternatives. But that's an issue for the Iranian people to decide, not for the United States.
Yeah, something I would add on that is that when Reese and I were in Tehran, and so this was maybe 15 years ago, and Reese and Sean would tease me justifiably because I had one question that I kept asking the men and women in the street over all others. I would ask everybody I talked to who could speak English or who was with me with a translator, and that is, do you support nuclear power in Iran? And I must have asked 50 people at least. And I think I found one who said no. And 98% or so said, yes, I definitely support nuclear power for Iran. And it was overwhelmingly, the reason was what Reese just described. Well, you have it in the United States, the Western Europe countries have it. You think we're not good enough?
Nima, go ahead.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think the Iranian people, they know their history, right? They know what happened with Mossadegh. They understand how foreign countries have meddled in their integrity for decades. But even more so, they remember the Iraq War. Saddam was the aggressor. He invaded. And when Iran went to the United Nations, because that's what that institution was designed to prevent or at least stop, the United Nations didn't do anything.
Nima, Nima, you should adjust your computer. You're off center.
Can you hear me now?
No, but it's the video.
I'm off center.
There you go. A little more.
There we go. Okay.
I think it's looking great, personally.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm in cash chic for COVID. So, I think when Iran went to the United Nations to get help, and when the United Nations didn't actually stop the war, and in fact, countries that are part of the Security Council started funding or at least providing weapons to Saddam, Iran had a choice to make. And so I think the Iranian people, lost a million lives in that war or something close to that. I think 1.5 million died in that war total, mostly Iranians. When your territorial integrity has been attacked in such a violent way, and you were at risk of losing, which they were, the nuclear weapon becomes the real solution to prevent it in the future, right? It's the ultimate deterrent. If the world institutions that were designed after World War II to maintain peace fail, what are you going to do as a nation state? It doesn't matter if it's Iran. You can give me any country I mean, Israel has nuclear weapons for reasons that make logical sense in the formulas of international relations. When your people have been targeted to extermination, right? When you look at the Holocaust, it makes logical sense. You're gonna hold the weapon that's gonna prevent that from happening again. And so Iran, it makes logical sense. If the institutions aren't going to protect you, if the countries with nuclear weapons aren't going to protect you, you're gonna get a nuclear weapon. And the way the Germans and the Japanese have gotten around it post World War II is they have breakout capability. If they need to make a nuclear one, they've got all the tools to do it. Nobody ever talks about that. They have their nuclear deterrent. It's just not put together. And so I've talked about writing a book or writing a movie script where an alien race invades, and they're not hostile. They just put a gun to our heads to resolve our differences and come to peace. And I bet you if that happened, we'd find a way to resolve this shit. So maybe if someone wants to collaborate on that story, I'm game. But sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Nima.
Yeah, I'm done. Yeah.
Brett, you had a comment as well?
Yeah, let me just put my hand down here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, and to build on that, when we talk about meddling, a lot of the times people who are in the know, they talk about past events like the 1953 Operation Ajax and all that, but sometimes people forget it's ongoing. I mean, it's like going beyond like John McCain singing "Bomb, Bomb, Bomb Iran" and every single successive administration threatening Iran at one time or another. You have support for like groups like the MEK, the Mujahideen al-Kek, who are trained in Nevada and with bipartisan, support from Rudy Giuliani and I forget who the Democrats who backed them, and then you have these the cyber attacks and the assassination of the nuclear scientists and just all these things. And as Reese was saying before, it's portrayed in the United States, like the history starts in 1979 with the embassy takeover, and in reality, that was the reaction to a quarter century or more of Western, meddling and ongoing, and that just seems to get ignored. To what Norm was speaking, it just seems to get ignored in the narrative, and so it does seem only natural that there's a point of pride and of a people who an ancient people to and even with all that in mind, that they are not developing, the fact that they're not actually developing nuclear weapons is actually maybe more astonishing, given all the constant, incessant hostility toward them.
So, thank you, Brett. So Iran and U.S. are in a standoff right now as to who's going to make the first move. If it's going to be Joe Biden or Iran first, what do you think is going to happen? Who's going to go first? And how will that affect Iranian election coming up in a few months?
Vahid, mind if I answer one thing on the UAE? Is the question now? I think we got to zoom out a little bit. Israel used, during the Cold War, they were very useful to the United States, and that was sort of a big pretense for our relationship. After the Cold War, Israel needed a new enemy, and Iran became that enemy, became the boogeyman. And you see things like the Abraham Accords, where now the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, countries that were not at war, and were not at war, working together to oppose Iran, are now creating this new bloc in the Middle East, and made even more permanent with these massive weapons deals, not just nuclear. There was a $23 billion weapons deal to the UAE in the lame duck of the Trump administration, with PGMs, precision guided munitions, Reaper drones, and F-35s. Massive amounts of weaponry. And that's, okay, we gave them the Abraham Accords. They normalized with Israel, and a lot of members feel like they owe the UAE something, even though that they're perpetuating so much violence and death in Yemen. even though they're breaking a UN arms embargo in Libya to transfer, U.S.-made weapons to warlords that are committing war crimes. So we have to, we have to really think about these relationships that these countries have, and we have to ask ourselves in the U.S., is leading the Middle East really the best thing for our national security? Like, is perpetually being pushed into more war, more conflict, is that benefiting Americans? I'd say hell no. And what we really need to do is restore diplomacy with Iran and try to, off-ramp a little bit on this toxic relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It's going to be really hard. It's going to be harder with the UAE. I'm telling you, that's a tough nut to crack, because folks in Congress and even the Biden administration, they praise this Abraham Accord. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Yeah, I'd add, I think Hassan's making a key point, and the praise of this Abraham Accord is sort of in the tradition of the peace process, the peace process that never existed really as a peace process, but now we're hearing that the Abraham Accord is a peace effort, and so on and so forth. I'm really struck by that 30 years ago or more, 40 years ago, the US media paradigm and the politics from Washington was Israel surrounded by hostile Arabs. And that's really shifted now. It's like the good Arab countries that are friendly with Israel, or maybe do a little bit of rhetoric against Israel, or cry crocodile tears about Palestinians, but then they're actually supremely aligned with Israel, like Saudi Arabia, and they're united by hostility towards Iran. And so the whole it's very hard to keep track of the moving parts, because the parts have been moving so much, and certainly U.S. news media don't usually do much to clarify in a meaningful way.
Thank you, Norman. So who's going to make the first move between Iran and U.S. in regards to bringing down the temperature? What's going to happen there? Reese, what's your view?
Well, I think the U.S. should be the one to bring down the temperature, and is certainly capable of doing that. I outlined one possible direction. But I think that the Biden administration has to decide, is it committed to returning to the JCPOA as written? Or is it going to try to insert new issues that either had already been discussed or already been rejected into the conversation? Once the U.S. makes that decision, then it will be much easier to proceed. All these tactical issues of who does what, who makes the first concessions, all that can be dealt with. These are very sophisticated diplomats. Is the U.S. willing to go back to what it had originally agreed to, or is it going to attempt to stick other issues in and anger the Iranians, who could very easily walk away?
Yeah, I mean, what faith do the Iranian government has that in 4 years, when a new administration comes in, will not renege on its deal again? Nima.
What I was going to say is, I think the Iranian regime was trying to wait out Trump, right? So they were waiting for him to leave so that they could re-engage with the United States. And if I look at past history and how the United States and Iran have conducted their diplomacy, there's a lot of back channeling, right? And I would bet that since the Biden administration has taken power and they've identified their negotiating leaders, I would be willing to bet, and we'll probably read about this 3 months, 6 months from now, maybe next year, there's some back channeling happening. Conversations are being had to set up what it would look like to come back to it. I think what we're seeing in the media is posturing, things that need to happen, signals that are being sent, sure. But I think back channels, which have existed before, are being reopened and conversations are being had. So I'm optimistic that we're going to see a deal. It might be a little different than what we had before, but I'm optimistic.
Hassan, I'm going to combine it with one question and give you the final word from one of the audiences on YouTube. They're asking about potential IMF loans to Iran and what kind of conditions they would have in terms of getting financial aid from the World Bank and IMFs of the world and being able to recover their economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I could just answer that one first. We saw you know, we are seeing some movement in the Biden administration. They just issued that they're going to do a sanctions review, you know, not just on Iran, but all over. I think that signals that they are rethinking sanctions. We need more pressure there. Rep. Ilhan Omar has some great legislation. I urge people to support her Pathways for Peace to, you know, look at how we, you know, use sanctions more broadly. The IMF loan, that's, you know, early in the early stages. It hasn't been approved, but it's being considered right now. That to me is probably a sign that the Biden administration is giving a wink and a nod to the IMF, saying that they, you know, wouldn't oppose that. So I wanted to give people a little practical advice on 3 members who I actually, let's say 6 members that I think would, 6 senators that could really shape this conversation. Senator Menendez in New Jersey, he needs so much pressure right now. That is the guy. He's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's let's use the maximum pressure as leverage to get a better deal, aka the Trump plan was really cool. Let's keep doing it. Cruel plan. He needs to be pushed. Senator Cardin, Senator Coons. Coons is really close to Biden. He's Delaware. The peace movement is super weak. Out Delaware. I'm sorry. It needs love. It needs a little bit of love. So if you know anybody from Delaware, get them activated. Senator Cardin from Maryland. He's the number 2 Senate Foreign Relations person. I'm close by there. I can do a little work there. Senator Schumer. I think Senator Schumer's interesting. He's moved quite a bit, and he now, you know, is saying that he supports the Iran nuclear deal. I think we could push him, if we can get him to say the Iran nuclear deal is good for Israel's national security or something. I think that would be, you know, really powerful. I think he's on the fence there. We could push him. And then 2 others is Arizona Senators Sinema and Kelly. They are like the frontline Democrats of the Senate. And if, you know, they just voted to arm the UAE in December. And so they need some pressure too. So I would just leave people with that. I think it's time to double down, get engaged. This isn't going to happen on its own. We need to really just keep pushing.
Great. Thank you all. I really appreciate the time you spent with us today. We're going to have a quick video. And after that, we move to Debbie Durst and some comedy. So please stick around.